Of course, more proximately, the reason we're here tonight is because of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people, and the subsequent righteous, multicultural, multiracial, multi-generational uprising demanding greater oversight and accountability of police, but also one which knows its history and understands how even the best intentioned reforms, decade after decade, have failed to make policing safe, just, and equitable, especially for communities of color. I just want to give an opportunity for Task Force Member and Advisory Committee Chair Mike Sandman to say a few words about our work and the need for Brookline to take this approach.
Let's step back from the details of the task force report. I've been told that some of my fellow task force members came with a preconceived set of ideas about policing, that they had radical plans to defund the police. That certainly wasn't true for me. I am not a progressive Democrat. I'm a recovering Republican. Nor did it turn out to be true of the task force as a whole. We did our work in a spirit of open inquiry. If the recommendations we developed through that inquiry do include some of the ideas that task force members already had about how policing in Brookline should be reimagined, well, perhaps those ideas are valid. Looking at this problem more broadly, police officers join up to protect the community and to enforce the law, but we're also asking them to provide social services. Given American history and experience, it's no surprise that the combination doesn't work very well. The task force recognizes that and therefore recommends combining the town's social services, including services delivered by the police, under a single new department. There's a cost, yes, but we're spending money now on programs that don't serve the putative beneficiaries well, no matter how well-intentioned those programs are. Whatever ideas individuals on the task force had when we started, our recommendations are based on thorough and thoughtful analysis of data. We know the recommendations can't be put in place overnight, but they are nonetheless valid, and we ask you to accept them with an open mind. Thank you.
And no, this isn't about what happened so many years ago or 1,000 miles away in Minneapolis or Louisville or Ferguson. This work is about policing right here in Brookline. It's about the many complaints, those that have been filed, and the many more that have been shared in other ways, including by two of Brookline's own now former police officers. We understand that there are many people in this community who love the police department and have only had good experiences. But as one insightful commenter said at a previous public hearing, your good experience does not cancel out someone else's bad experience. The 11 members of our task force do believe inequitable policing is a problem in Brookline, and we're not alone. We're joined by Brookline's Anyosa family, whose daily peaceful protests along Route 9 brought hundreds of residents to join them, and then hundreds more at protests across from the Brookline Police Department. We're joined by Brookline's Lexi Harriman, BHS students, and thousands of residents and neighbors who took to the streets peacefully to share their stories of local issues with policing right here in Brookline. For anyone who attended these events and others, like the Humanized Black Voices event led by young people on Cypress Field, the evidence is clear. Yes, there is a problem here in Brookline.
It's very clear that there is a widespread acknowledgement among a representative sample of the community that we have a problem of racial discrimination in the Brookline Police Department and a problem of accountability in the Brookline Police Department. It's not policing in general or national policing, it is the Brookline Police Department. And to me, I didn't go into this survey thinking one way or the other about what the community input would be on that front, but it's very clear.
So just for anyone watching, just to reiterate, this survey was designed and implemented by Brian Shafter, who is a political scientist at Tufts. Just for clarification, I'll say that I am also a professor of political science at Tufts. Brian is my colleague, but I had nothing to do with this survey, except we knew it was happening because of me. So Brian was doing this survey of Medford and Somerville, the host communities of Tufts. We saw the questionnaire, realized this was an opportunity for us to get data on Brookline. So we, the task force, voted with funding from the town. We asked Professor Schaffner to run the survey in Brookline as well. This is, I think, one of the most important parts of the survey, and let me just frame it by saying here's why. As we know, and has been emphasized by Raul's comments earlier today, there's obviously a lot of widespread issues in policing in the country, and there's always a question here in Brookline of whether the perceptions of the police here reflect perceptions across the country, or is Brookline somehow distinct or unique in its in the public's perceptions of it with respect to discrimination, particularly discrimination against a non-white. So here's what here's the survey asks. First, it asks, have you ever felt discriminated against by the Brookline police because of your race or ethnicity? Again, this question is not asking about police in general. This is a question asking about the Brookline Police Department. Have you ever felt discriminated against the Brookline Police Department because of your race or ethnicity? White identifiers, basically none of them say yes. Asians is very low, but 10% of Latinos and about 30% of African Americans say they have felt discriminated against the Brookline police because of race or ethnicity.
And my experience with Brookline and my son's experience in Brookline has been absolutely horrible, right? So I call it now lately, living Black in Brookline, right? And that's hard, right? Especially when you have 6 sons that you have to be afraid for because of the police. The first year we moved to Brookline, my son was simply walking down the street with a hoodie on, and the police followed him around and followed him around. That's never okay, right? So then I had to tell my son, don't wear a hoodie, don't walk in Brookline at night. That's not okay. My next son, Brookline high school student, he's just walking his white friend home one day from school. Brookline police officer tells him, don't walk my daughter home from school. That's not okay. My sons shouldn't have to be afraid. I shouldn't have to send text messages out to my sons at night if they're not home, because they're adults now. Are you inside and are you safe? That should never be the case. And that's what it feels like to live in Brookline.
I feel scared for my life living in Brookline, and my kids do. Things need to improve for Black people. The 15-year-old Black kid that was coming from school and was stopped by a police officer without any probable cause, and decided to search the kid's bag. It shouldn't be. Kids should be allowed to walk from school to their home without any of these police interactions. The term Brookline is the most racist city or town in Massachusetts. We want to erase that. We want to make people feel welcome to come to Brookline.
Especially as an Asian American, I'm very much taken aback. I'm pissed off right now. We see, Asian Americans drivers being ticketed more often than anybody else. Okay, does that mean I have to pay more as an Asian American for driving around Brookline? Whereas other people, this is disproportionality. This is discrimination.
Then all of the people in the survey are asked how they think the Brookline police treats different racial groups. So here, for example, here is the percent of each racial group in the survey who thinks that the police treat white residents unfairly. Okay, so 1% of white residents themselves think the Brookline police treats white residents unfairly. 4% for Latinx, but it's close to 0. So here's for Asians. So much higher than for whites. So most racial groups, all racial groups think that, at a rate of like 10%, 15% think that the Brookline police treats Asian residents unfairly. When we get to, the survey uses the language Hispanics here to present thinks Hispanics are treated unfairly. Again, now you have 35 to 45% of Brookline residents of all racial groups believe that the Brookline police treat Hispanic residents unfairly. And it's even higher for African Americans, right? So you have, close to half of the white residents of Brookline believe that the Brookline police treat African Americans who are African American residents of the community unfairly.
You can read the results of that work in the annual reports published by our police department. Unfortunately, the published results show that we do still have quite some way to go. If you consider only resident arrests as a Black resident of Brookline, you are 5.5 times more likely to be arrested by our Brookline police than you would be as a white resident of Brookline. For field interrogations, stops basically by the police, 52% of the non-residents questioned were Black. Our neighbor Boston is only 23% Black, and Brookline is only 3.4% Black. So that's quite a disparity as well.
I have Black friends living in Boston who avoid visiting my neighborhood because of past experiences and their heightened anxiety and stress when being in our town, because either 1, of being pulled over without merit, 2, the fear of being pulled over by Brookline police, or 3, the fear of being in my neighborhood because a neighbor's first instinct will be to call the police due to their implicit biases or just explicit racism.
Listening to friends who are Black and live in Brookline, I know their experiences with the police are very different from those of myself and my white friends and neighbors. People of color have told me how they're pulled over and harassed by Brookline police officers. One friend told me his friends deliberately drive around Brookline to avoid our local police.
When we looked at speeding stops, and please check this out in our report, we looked at speeding stops. It's actually the #1 reason that we stop people in Brookline is for speeding. And there were over, the numbers we looked at were over 1,000 stops for speeding. This is not looking through a windshield at night trying to figure out what the race of the driver is. This is the stop has been made and a determination has been made by the officer for whatever reason that this person has been speeding. And what we saw in terms of the disparities between citations and between a warning, between a ticket and a warning, is that when white motorists, who are the vast majority of motorists that are stopped, but when white motorists are stopped, less than 1/3 of them get a ticket. When Asian motorists are stopped, almost 1/2 of them get a ticket. And we see in nearly every category, if you're a white driver, you are much more likely to get off with a warning than if you're a driver of color. We've asked Chief Morgan, Chief O'Leary to find some explanation for those data that aren't about race, that are about something else. And no one's been able to come up with any reasonable explanation that doesn't involve race in some way. And so this idea that that there is no bias in traffic stops, we see it when the race of the person is theoretically known by the officer. Once the stop has already occurred, the idea that there's no bias in traffic stops, it just belies all of the data that exists everywhere. Everything that the ACLU and Rasan Hall presented to us and talked with us about sort of data, not just in Brookline, but outside. We can't fix a problem unless we're willing to actually admit that there is a problem. And if we keep trying to find excuses for the issues that we have in policing, we're never gonna solve those problems. The idea that there are people in our community who are unhappy with the Brookline police, and that a great number of those people are people of color, I'm sorry, it's not debatable. It's the reason we're here. That's why we're here. That's why these bodies were created. It wasn't to reimagine policing in Minneapolis or to reform policing in Louisville. It was to do it in Brookline. And if I don't know if you weren't at the Humanized Black Voices event and got to hear person after person after person who live in Brookline and grew up in Brookline talk about their issues with policing in Brookline. I don't know if you got to stand out with us with the Anyosa family and hear about the many people in Brookline who had issues with police in Brookline. And I don't know if you got to be there for that wonderful, like just giant and peaceful march to the police department, where people shared their stories of inequitable policing here in Brookline, and maybe you missed all that or didn't read the articles about it or whatever. That's why we're here in the first place.
Respondents were asked, which of the following police tactics and weaponry do you believe the Brookline police should be allowed to use to ensure public safety? And this is a pretty interesting table. So here, for example, 52% of respondents say that yes, pepper spray is a tactic or weaponry that people believe the Brookline police should be allowed to use to ensure public safety. Obviously, so the range of these things is like restraint devices like handcuffs and zip ties have the highest level of support, 87%. Chokeholds have the lowest level of support. I think what's notable about this table is that Brookline residents, basically, for the majority of these tools, the majority of Brookline residents do not want the police using them. The majority do not want police using firearms, beanbag munitions, canine dog, bite and hold. The majority do not want tear gas, impact weapons, chokeholds. Most of these things do not have majority support among Brookline residents as tools and tactics of the police department. Okay, here's a really interesting table as well. In given situations, it's possible to have either police or social service workers, such as social workers, medics, or mental health professionals respond. For each of the following situations, please indicate whether you think it would be better for the police or social service workers to respond. All right, in any kind of a physical situation, an armed individual robbery, you have widespread support for just the police. But for most of these scenarios, sorry, I just realized I misspelled overdose. Intoxication overdose, mental health crisis, homeless person, neighborly dispute, even the majority of the people in the survey, the majority think that just not even police and social service workers together, but the majority of respondents think just social service workers should be deployed in those situations.
Reformation policies like body cameras and civilian review boards are only as effective as the accountability mechanisms in place, which is to say, what will a civilian review board accomplish if police unions continue to hold more political power than them?
We're positing an oversight committee that would have the power to investigate, and the reform committee is not quite doing that.
Let me start by saying that The presumption of the Police Reforms Committee is that the Brookline Police Department is a very good department in all areas of current concerns with policing nationally. As I've always said, it's not perfect. We have a lot of issues that we need to resolve, but I urge the community and this board to not undermine the very, very good, because it is not perfect.
As for the work of the committee, except for Ron Wilkinson's complaint form, I really cannot support it. The overwhelming concept has been to endorse the police.
As a member of the Reform Committee, I witnessed the select board chair mock the chokehold, then rush the ban as in the chokehold ban as a quote, easy win for his own political gain. He refused to have the full committee hear from complainants, citing that they were not vetted, quote, vetted, and not sure if their stories are, quote, reliable.
Existing police internal affairs process, which our recommendation leaves in place, is biased towards exonerating officers. I can testify to that. That is the experience across the country of the police investigating the police. Brookline is not any different.
By the way, remember this committee of the Reform Committee was the chair of that subcommittee is the department head in the police department who literally oversees those officers. That was the chair of that subcommittee.
Second, the limited interviews we conducted of complaints revealed that the internal affairs reports do in fact on occasion unfairly favor the police version of events and discredit complainants in subtle ways. An advisory committee that simply reviews internal affairs reports has no authority to conduct independent investigations. That will be unable to hold police accountable. It will not be able to get to the facts. Boston had a similar process and it failed.
Chair Green instructed Reform Committee members to place certain items at the back of the report, quote, in order to make it harder for some people to say this is just PR for the police. The credibility of the Reform Committee report is flawed.
See if there are ways in which the report's enthusiasm for the great programs we have here in Brookline and the great job the police does with respect to those programs causes a sort of over exuberance. I mean, I found a few places where I think we need to tone it down and even though, great work is being done, we don't want to appear to be sort of PRing some of this stuff.
When I look at their reform committee, something's very bothering about the makeup of your committee, right? You have the people of color in that committee having a problem with the recommendation and the way they are being treated within the committee. And that's something in its own self, because I have a lot of people in our community in this meeting watching today. So I just hope that people listening should put that into consideration, just to look at the reform committee itself and before taking their recommendation, how they treat their own people within the committee. Live testimonies are there. And
all I hear is a mission creep and an FTE expansion. As a Black woman, it makes me uncomfortable to hear what you all are talking about. Ultimately, it just reads like what you're trying to do is just perpetuate what's already here. And that's a disappointment. Instead, they should have spent more time working on why there is such a fundamental lack of trust of the police department. I don't think that work was really done to build trust. There must be consequences, and the public must trust the information. Police can't investigate themselves. There has to be improved data collection and reporting practices to expose interactions with law enforcement as a tool to accountability. Racial disparities have to be explored in all aspects of policing. Again, the report does a poor job of doing that. I think that there was a real missed opportunity in laying out how the walk and talk program or the school program is any different than the broken windows policing policy. What we have to do is reduce our reliance on policing in our communities. And more importantly, if you're going to have the police, you have to make sure that they are used in a role that not only protects some, but protects all, and more importantly, doesn't leave a large segment of this community afraid.
A driving theme of last summer's protest was a call to scale back the power and presence of police and for communities to instead invest in people's economic and social needs instead of the police. So, if you may, to address the root causes of crime and despair. So I'm wondering how the members of the committee kind of square that with the fact that many of your recommendations would likely expand the police's budget. And what comes to mind is similarly is the task force found that within the Brookline Police Department, like patterns of racial discrimination in areas like traffic enforcement, as well as widespread recognition in the town of there currently being little to no oversight of the BPD.
We've done our research, we've done our work, and we've got a survey where a strong majority of Brookline residents support limiting the scope of police duties and limiting their power as well. A strong majority supports, this is Brookline residents of the Brookline PD, supports greater accountability and greater transparency as well. I think what members of the select board are going to see when we show back up here and make our presentation in March is that we're not proposing anything that is not well supported by the community. This is one of the things that I think, I really want to encourage like my fellow select board members, because we'll say things like, we haven't heard from people of color. And I'm like, well, the majority of people on this task force are people of color, first of all. We haven't heard from anybody in public housing. We have a member of our task force who lives every day in public housing, and that's not the only person we've heard from, but we've been deeply informed by that by that contribution there. And so, it's a reminder that this is not a group of 11 people who are apart from the community or communities that they're sort of investigating, but live in the community and are impacted by policing as much as anybody else here. So I just want to say that. The other thing is what we are recommending in the end is something that people can vote for, not against the walk and talk unit or police or school resource officers specifically, but to vote for something. But in order to vote for that thing, there are trade-offs that need to happen. And we've identified what we think those trade-offs should be.
Bernard, I stood up on behalf of the advisory committee and opposed the motion to reduce the police budget back in
I just use that as an example. I mean,
May 2019, because there was nothing else being put in place. This task force is recommending what should be put in place. And the whole focus of the whole thing that we'd like you to focus on as a select board is, okay, if these things make sense, now let's start to put the alternatives in place. Let's find the additional $500,000. That's not a small amount of money, but it's not an overwhelming amount of money. And if the concept makes sense, let's get to work on it. Rather than just say, well, you have to have something else in place. You can do something about it. And that's what we're asking you to do.
I think the larger conversation we need to have is where we want to go in the future and what we need to do to get there. We've got a vision that we've laid out in this task force report, and it doesn't include walk and talk officers or school resource officers. It just doesn't, right? And I don't think that's a condemnation of any individual officer or the department or anything like that. It's a trade-off that I think needs to be made.
This will make more of Brookline citizenry feel safe. That what we're saying in this reimagining is actually asking for all of our citizens to feel closer to feeling safe all the time. And that this is my belief that reforming the existing system does not do that.